Marvin Gaye was shot twice in the chest by his own father. The .38 caliber gun used in the shooting was a gift Marvin himself had bought for him months earlier. By then, he was already one of the most influential voices in soul music, with millions of records sold and songs that shaped an entire generation. But behind the music and fame was a family war that had followed him since childhood. How did it end like this? Before the gunshots, Marvin Gaye had already become one of the most important voices in American music. By the early 1970s, his records were selling in the millions and his songs were everywhere. I Heard It Through the Grapevine had become one of Motown's biggest hits. Let's Get It On turned him into the voice of intimacy and vulnerability. But the moment that changed everything came in 1971 with an album that almost never happened. What's Going On? Motown executives originally refused to release it. They believed audiences did not want a soul album about war, police violence, and the emotional collapse of the country. Marvin disagreed. He stopped recording entirely and refused to release new music until the label allowed it. When the album finally came out, it sold millions of copies and redefined what soul music could be. Critics later called it one of the greatest albums ever recorded. For the world, Marvin Gaye had become something more than a singer. He was now a voice of conscience in American music. But while millions of people were listening to his songs about love, pain, and healing, Marvin himself was carrying a fear that had started long before fame ever arrived. And that fear had a name he could never escape: his own father. Long before Marvin Gaye became one of the most recognizable voices in American music, he was a quiet boy growing up in a tense house in Washington, D.C. He was born in 1939 into a family dominated by strict religion and rigid authority. His father, Marvin Gaye Sr., was a storefront preacher who believed discipline was the foundation of a godly home. Inside that house, rules controlled almost every part of daily life. Secular music was condemned. Dancing was forbidden. Questioning authority was treated as rebellion. Children were expected to obey instantly and without emotion. When they did not, punishment followed. Marvin later described his childhood as a place ruled by fear. His father had a violent temper and believed physical punishment was a necessary tool to keep his children obedient. Marvin was often the target. Sometimes the beatings came because of small mistakes. Other times there seemed to be no reason at all. The violence created a constant tension inside the home. Every conversation felt cautious. Every movement felt watched. For a sensitive child like Marvin, that environment left deep emotional scars. Yet within that same house of strict control, something unexpected began to grow. Music. Because his father was a preacher, the family spent long hours in church. Gospel singing filled the services. Choir rehearsals echoed through the building. It was there that Marvin first discovered his voice. As a child, he joined the church choir, and people quickly noticed that something about his singing felt different. His voice carried a soft vulnerability, but also a powerful emotional depth. Even at a young age, listeners could hear feeling in the way he held notes and shaped melodies. For Marvin, singing became a form of escape. When he sang, the fear inside the house seemed to disappear for a moment. Music created a space where he could breathe freely. It allowed him to express emotions he was never allowed to show at home. But this escape also created another problem. His father did not celebrate Marvin's musical talent. In fact, he often seemed threatened by it. Attention from church members and neighbors sometimes shifted away from the preacher and toward the young boy with the remarkable voice. That attention did not sit well with Marvin Gaye Sr. Instead of pride, the growing recognition of Marvin's talent sometimes triggered more tension inside the home. The more Marvin's voice stood out, the more complicated his relationship with his father became. Music was slowly becoming the center of Marvin's identity, but it was also deepening the divide between him and the man who ruled the household. Praise from outsiders could not soften the hostility waiting behind the front door. Marvin learned to live between two emotional worlds. In church, he was admired and encouraged. At home, he often felt unwanted. Years later, Marvin would admit that he never truly felt safe in his father's presence. Even as he grew into adulthood, the psychological shadow of that childhood followed him. The beatings, the silence, and emotional distance planted something inside him that never fully healed. Many people who worked with Marvin later noticed that he carried an unusual mixture of confidence and vulnerability. On stage, he could command an audience with incredible emotional power. Off stage, he often seemed uncertain, fragile, and deeply sensitive to rejection. Those contradictions began in that Washington household. Music had saved him in one way. It gave him purpose, identity, and eventually a path out of the environment that had shaped his fears. But it also carried the emotional weight of everything he had experienced there. Every note he sang seemed to carry a quiet sadness beneath its beauty. By the time Marvin reached his teenage years, he understood something clearly. If he wanted to build a life for himself, he would eventually have to leave that house behind. The problem was that leaving physically did not mean escaping emotionally. The influence of his father had already carved itself deeply into Marvin's sense of self. Even after he found fame, success, and worldwide recognition, the shadow of that relationship would still follow him. It would shape his relationships, his insecurities, and the fragile peace he constantly searched for. But before Marvin Gaye could become the voice that millions of people would one day listen to, he first had to find a way to step beyond the walls of the home where fear had defined his childhood. The question was whether leaving that house would truly free him, or whether the conflict inside that family would eventually find its way back into his life. Leaving home did not happen in one dramatic moment. It happened slowly, step by step, as Marvin Gaye searched for distance from the life that had shaped him. By the late 1950s, he began moving further away from Washington, trying to build a life that did not revolve around his father's authority. Music was the only path he could see, but it was far from a guaranteed escape. In the beginning, Marvin was not even known as a singer. He worked mainly as a drummer. He played in small rhythm and blues groups, learning the structure of songs and the discipline of performing night after night. The pay was inconsistent and the venues were often rough, but the experience was shaping him quietly. Behind the drum kit, he studied how great performers controlled a room. He listened carefully to vocal phrasing and arrangements. Even then, he was absorbing the details that would later define his own sound. Eventually, his path led him to Detroit, where a small but ambitious record company was beginning to reshape American music. Motown Records, founded by Berry Gordy, was building a roster of artists who would soon dominate radio. When Marvin first entered the Motown environment, he was not immediately treated as a star. In fact, his early role was mostly behind the scenes. He played drums during recording sessions and provided background vocals for other artists. But Berry Gordy noticed something about him. Marvin had an unusual combination of musical discipline and emotional sensitivity. His voice carried a softness that felt different from many male singers of the time. Gordy believed that if that voice was placed in the right songs, it could reach audiences in a powerful way. Marvin's early singles for Motown were modest successes. Songs like Stubborn Kind of Fellow and Hitchhike began introducing him to radio listeners. They showed that his voice could fit comfortably within the polished Motown style. Yet Marvin himself was not entirely comfortable with the direction of his career. At the time, he dreamed of becoming a sophisticated jazz singer, closer to artists like Nat King Cole than the dance-driven soul records Motown specialized in. This tension between what Marvin wanted to be and what the industry expected from him would follow him throughout his career. Around this time, another complicated relationship entered his life. Marvin met Anna Gordy, the older sister of Berry Gordy. Anna was already deeply involved in the Motown business and was significantly older than Marvin, nearly 17 years his senior. Despite the age difference, the two formed a strong connection and eventually married. The marriage gave Marvin a deeper position inside the Motown family. Professionally, it strengthened his ties to the label. Personally, it brought both stability and pressure. Being connected to the Gordy family meant that Marvin's career was closely tied to the expectations of the company. Success was encouraged, but independence was limited. Through the mid-1960s, Marvin's reputation slowly grew. His smooth vocal style began attracting wider attention. Audiences responded to the emotional honesty in his singing. Unlike many performers who relied on pure power, Marvin often delivered his lines with restraint, allowing subtle emotion to carry the performance. Yet even as his career began rising, Marvin's inner world remained complicated. The distance from Washington had given him freedom, but it had not erased the psychological weight of his childhood. Those early experiences had shaped his personality in ways that were difficult to escape. He could appear confident in the studio, yet privately he often struggled with insecurity and doubt. Music had given him a new life, but it had not completely healed the wounds he carried. Still, by the mid-1960s, the momentum around Marvin Gaye was becoming impossible to ignore. Radio stations were playing his songs more frequently. Concert audiences were growing larger. Within the Motown system, he was transforming from a session musician into a genuine star. And soon, a partnership with another young singer would produce some of the most memorable songs of that era. Their chemistry would captivate audiences across the country and help push Marvin Gaye fully into the spotlight. But that partnership would also end in a tragedy that would leave a permanent mark on him. Because just as Marvin's career was beginning to reach its brightest moment, life was about confronting with a loss he would never fully recover from. By the mid-1960s, Marvin Gaye was no longer a background musician inside Motown. His voice had become one of the label's most recognizable sounds. Radio stations across the United States were playing his records regularly, and audiences were beginning to associate his name with a particular kind of emotional sincerity. Songs like How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You and I Heard It Through the Grapevine carried his voice into millions of homes. The latter would eventually become one of Motown's biggest hits, selling more than 2 million copies and cementing Marvin's place among the label's leading artists. But the defining moment of this period did not come from a solo record. It came from a partnership. Motown paired Marvin with a young singer named Tammi Terrell. Together, they recorded a series of duets that would become some of the most beloved songs of the era. Ain't No Mountain High Enough, Your Precious Love, and Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing captured a chemistry that felt genuine and spontaneous. Their voices blended effortlessly. Audiences believed the emotion they heard in those recordings because it sounded real. On stage, their connection was equally powerful. Concert crowds responded immediately to the warmth between them. For many listeners, Marvin and Tammi represented the perfect musical pair. Two voices carrying joy, affection, and hope through Motown's polished sound. Behind the scenes, the relationship between them was complex. Some people close to the recordings later suggested that their bond was not romantic in a conventional sense, but deeply emotional and supportive. Tammi brought a brightness into Marvin's life that balanced his natural seriousness. For someone who often struggled with internal doubt, her energy helped create moments of genuine happiness. But that period of light would not last long. In October 1967, during a concert in Virginia, Tammi Terrell suddenly collapsed on stage in Marvin's arms. The performance stopped instantly as crew members rushed forward. Doctors soon discovered the cause, a brain tumor. The diagnosis changed everything overnight. For the next few years, Tammi endured surgeries and treatments, while Marvin watched helplessly from the sidelines. The two continued recording together when her health allowed, but the atmosphere around their work had changed. What had once been joyful collaborations now carried the weight of uncertainty. In March 1970, Tammi Terrell died at the age of 24. Her death devastated Marvin Gaye. Those who worked with him during that time said he was never quite the same afterward. He blamed himself for continuing the recording sessions while she was ill, even though he had no control over the situation. The guilt settled deep inside him. For months, he withdrew from performing. Concert appearances became rare. Interviews were almost non-existent. Music, which had once been a refuge, now felt heavy with memory. Yet from that darkness, something unexpected began to form. Marvin started thinking about music differently. Instead of recording simple love songs designed for radio play, he began writing about the world around him. The Vietnam War was escalating. American cities were facing protests, violence, and political division. Marvin felt that the music industry was ignoring these realities. He wanted to create something more honest. That desire would soon lead to one of the most important decisions of his career. A decision that Motown executives initially rejected. A decision that risked his position inside the company. But Marvin believed the music had to be made. Because after the loss of Tammi Terrell, he no longer wanted to sing only about romance. He wanted to sing about pain, confusion, and the questions that were tearing the country apart. The result of that decision would be an album that changed the direction of soul music forever. But as Marvin prepared to challenge the system that had made him famous, another battle was beginning quietly inside his own life, one involving addiction, paranoia, and emotional pressure that would slowly push him toward the darkest period of his career. And once that spiral began, stopping it would become far more difficult than anyone around him realized. The success of What's Going On in 1971 changed Marvin Gaye's place in music forever. The album did not just sell well. It redefined what a soul artist could say. Instead of singing only about romance, Marvin had created a record that confronted war, poverty, police violence, and emotional exhaustion spreading across America. Critics later called it one of the greatest albums ever recorded. For the public, Marvin Gaye had become something more than a Motown star. He was now seen as a voice of conscience. But the success of that album did not bring him peace. In fact, the years that followed would become some of the most unstable in his life. Fame expanded his influence, but also magnified the emotional struggles he had carried since childhood. Marvin had always been sensitive and introspective. The deeper he went into his music, the more exposed he felt. Recording was no longer just a profession. It had become a place where he processed his fears, his doubts, and his sense of isolation. At the same time, his marriage to Anna Gordy was beginning to collapse. The relationship had always been complicated. Anna was not only his wife, but also part of the family that controlled Motown. That connection had helped Marvin's career early on, but it also created tension. As his independence grew, the distance between them widened. Arguments became more frequent. The emotional bond that once held the relationship together was slowly eroding. By the mid-1970s, the marriage was effectively over. But the legal and financial consequences were only beginning. When the divorce was finalized, the court ordered Marvin to pay a massive settlement. The amount was estimated at around $600,000, an enormous financial burden at the time. The pressure of that debt pushed him into one of the most unusual recording projects of his career. Instead of hiding the pain of the divorce, Marvin turned it into an album. The result was here, My Dear. The record was essentially a musical diary of the end of his marriage. Every track carried fragments of anger, regret, sarcasm, and emotional exhaustion. Some songs described arguments between the couple. Others reflected on emotional distance that had slowly destroyed their relationship. It was an album filled with raw, personal details that few artists would ever consider sharing publicly. When it was released in 1978, many listeners were confused. Critics initially dismissed it. The music industry expected another romantic soul record, not an intimate portrait of a collapsing marriage. But behind the album's unusual concept was something deeper. Marvin was beginning to lose control of his life. The financial stress from the divorce had not disappeared. Touring schedules were demanding. At the same time, cocaine had begun entering his daily routine. What started as occasional use slowly turned into dependence. Friends and colleagues later said the change in his behavior was obvious. Marvin could still perform brilliantly, but away from the stage his moods became unpredictable. Some days he seemed energetic and inspired. Other days he withdrew completely, avoiding conversations and isolating himself from people around him. The drug use also intensified a growing sense of paranoia. Marvin became convinced that powerful people were trying to harm him. He sometimes believed criminals or organized crime figures were watching him. In certain moments, he even suspected that the music industry itself was plotting against him. To outsiders, these fears seemed irrational. But for Marvin, they felt real. The anxiety followed him everywhere. He began sleeping with weapons nearby. He carried firearms when traveling. At times, he even wore a bulletproof vest under his clothes. The man who once sang about love and healing now moved through the world, as if danger could appear at any moment. Those close to him worried that the pressure was building towards something serious. The tragedy was that Marvin himself seemed to recognize what was happening. Yet he could not stop it. The more unstable his life became, the more he tried to escape through music, drugs, or isolation. By the end of the 1970s, his career still looked successful from the outside. His records were famous. His concerts still drew large audiences. But privately, the emotional collapse had already begun. And in the years that followed, the spiral would grow even more intense. Pushing Marvin away from America, away from the industry that had made him famous, and eventually toward a desperate attempt to rebuild his life far from everything he once knew. By the end of the 1970s, Marvin Gaye's life had entered a dangerous rhythm. Publicly, he was still a respected artist with a catalog of songs that defined an era. Privately, he was exhausted, paranoid, and increasingly dependent on cocaine. The drug had moved from occasional escape to daily necessity. Friends noticed that his sleep patterns were erratic. Nights stretched into mornings. Rehearsals were sometimes missed. Conversations drifted into long, anxious monologues about people who might be watching him or plotting against him. The fear was not abstract in his mind. Marvin became convinced that powerful figures want to control him or harm him. At times, he believed criminal organizations were trying to exploit his fame. Other times, he suspected people inside the music business. These fears pushed him further into isolation. He began trusting fewer people. Even longtime collaborators found it difficult to reach him emotionally. The instability was visible during tours. Some performances were extraordinary, as if the stage was the only place where his mind could briefly settle. In those moments, a voice was still there, smooth, expressive, capable of turning a quiet audience into a sea of emotion. But once the lights faded, the tension returned. Marvin sometimes refused to leave hotel rooms. At other times, he moved through cities with bodyguards and weapons close by, convinced danger was always nearby. Financial problems also continued to grow. The divorce settlement had drained much of his income, and his spending habits did not slow down. Taxes accumulated. Management disputes added more stress. By the end of the decade, the pressure from debt and addiction had become overwhelming. In 1980, Marvin made a decision that surprised many people around him. He left the United States. The move was partly an attempt to escape financial obligations, but it was also an emotional retreat. America had become a place associated with pressure, expectation, and fear. Marvin wanted distance. Eventually, he settled in Ostend, a quiet coastal city in Belgium. The change of environment was dramatic. Instead of crowded studios and industry offices, he found himself living near the sea, surrounded by slower rhythms of daily life. For the first time in years, he began to experience moments of calm. Friends who visited him in Belgium noticed that the atmosphere around him felt different. The isolation that had once fueled his paranoia now gave him space to reflect. The cocaine use decreased. He spent long hours listening to music, walking near the shoreline, and slowly reconnected with the creative instinct that had driven him earlier in his career. Music began to return in a new form. Rather than the heavy social commentary of the early 1970s or the emotional bitterness of Here, My Dear, Marvin started working on songs that felt more personal and intimate. The rhythm was lighter, the tone more reflective. It was not a complete transformation, but it suggested that he might be rebuilding something inside himself. By 1982, that process produced a song that would reintroduce him to the world, Sexual Healing. The track carried a modern sound that blended soul with emerging electronic rhythms. When it was released, the response was immediate. The song climbed the charts internationally and won 2 Grammy Awards. For audiences and critics alike, it felt like the return of Marvin Gaye. After years of instability, the man who had once defined an era of music seemed to have found his footing again. But recovery in Marvin's life was rarely simple. The success of Sexual Healing brought new attention, new interviews, and new expectations. With that attention came pressure to reconnect with the American music industry. Concert promoters wanted tours. Record companies wanted more material. Managers encouraged him to return to the United States and rebuild his career from the center of the industry. Eventually, Marvin agreed. He returned to America believing he might be ready to start again. To some people around him, he even seemed calmer than before. The time in Europe had given him a brief chance to breathe, but one decision would quietly undo that fragile stability. Instead of living independently when he came back to Los Angeles, Marvin moved into the home where his parents were living. The arrangement was meant to be temporary, a practical solution while he reorganized his finances and career. Yet that house contained the same emotional tension that had shaped his childhood decades earlier. The distance he had once created between himself and his father suddenly disappeared. And as the months passed, the arguments between them began returning with a familiar intensity. The man who had spent years trying to outrun his past was now living under the same roof with it again. Could Marvin Gaye truly rebuild his life while standing so close to the conflict that had haunted him since childhood? When Marvin Gaye returned to the United States in the early 1980s, many people believed they were witnessing the beginning of a second life. The success of Sexual Healing had reminded the world of his brilliance. The song reached the top of the charts in multiple countries and earned him 2 Grammy Awards. For the first time in years, interviews describe him as focused, reflective, even hopeful. To fans and critics, it looked like a comeback story. But inside Marvin's personal life, the situation was far more fragile. Financial pressure had not disappeared. Management conflicts still lingered. More importantly, the emotional stability he had briefly found in Europe had been built on distance. In Belgium, he had been physically separated from the places and relationships that had shaped his deepest anxieties. Back in Los Angeles, those pressures slowly began returning. The decision that would define this period of his life seemed simple at first. Instead of immediately purchasing a new home, Marvin chose to live with his parents while reorganizing his finances. The house was located in a quiet neighborhood, and the arrangement was meant to be temporary. On the surface, it sounded practical. In reality, it reopened a relationship that had never truly healed. Marvin Gaye Sr. was still the same man who had ruled the household decades earlier. Age had not softened his personality. His religious views remained rigid, and his relationship with his son was still marked by tension and resentment. For Marvin, being back in that house meant returning to an emotional environment that had shaped his earliest fears. At first, the conflicts were small. Disagreements about money, household responsibilities, or daily routines created friction. Marvin's lifestyle as a musician did not align with the strict moral expectations his father still carried. The house became a place where 2 very different worlds were forced to share the same space. As the months passed, those disagreements grew sharper. Family members later described an atmosphere that felt increasingly unstable. Arguments between father and son could erupt suddenly and escalate quickly. Marvin's emotional sensitivity, combined with the unresolved anger between them, created a volatile environment. The success of Sexual Healing had temporarily restored his public image, but inside the house the tension continued building. For Marvin, the situation carried an added psychological weight. Returning to the same environment where he had experienced childhood violence meant confronting memories that had never fully faded. The fame, the awards, and the millions of records sold could not erase those early experiences. Standing in that house again blurred the line between the successful adult he had become and the frightened boy he had once been. Yet there were also moments when Marvin seemed determined to rebuild himself. Friends noticed that he was still writing music and thinking about future projects. He spoke about the possibility of new recordings, new tours, and perhaps a more peaceful stage of life. The brief recovery he had experienced in Europe had not completely disappeared, but the emotional conflict inside the house was intensifying faster than his recovery could stabilize him. By early 1984, the arguments between Marvin and his father had become frequent and unpredictable. Some began as ordinary disagreements and ended in shouting. Others involved deeper accusations tied to their long and painful history. Family members sometimes tried to intervene, but the resentment between the 2 men ran too deep. What made the situation even more dangerous was that neither of them seemed capable of stepping away from the conflict. The house had become a place where decades of unresolved anger were slowly resurfacing. Each argument carried echoes of the past. Each confrontation pushed them closer to a moment neither of them fully understood. And as Marvin's 45th birthday approached, the fragile balance inside that house was beginning to collapse. The question was no longer whether the tension would explode. The question was when. By the end of March 1984, the atmosphere inside the house had become unbearable. The arguments between Marvin Gaye and his father were no longer occasional disagreements. They had become part of daily life. Small issues could suddenly ignite old resentments. Voices rose quickly. The tension lingered in every room. Family members later said that both men seemed emotionally exhausted. Years of unresolved anger had built a wall between them that neither one knew how to dismantle. Marvin had spent most of his adult life trying to escape the shadow of his father. Yet now, after decades of fame, success, and distance, he had returned to the same house where that shadow had first formed. On the morning of April 1st, 1984, another argument began. The conflict reportedly started over a small domestic dispute involving Marvin's mother and some misplaced documents. What might have remained a simple family disagreement quickly escalated. Marvin became furious when he believed his father had treated his mother harshly. The two men began shouting. Years of bitterness poured into the confrontation. In the heat of the moment, Marvin physically pushed his father. It was not the first time their arguments had turned physical, but this time the situation moved in a direction no one could reverse. Marvin Gaye Sr. left the room and walked into his bedroom. Inside the room was a .38 caliber pistol. The gun had been purchased months earlier. It had been a gift from Marvin. Moments later, Marvin's father returned to the hallway. 2 shots were fired. One bullet struck Marvin in the chest. Another entered his shoulder. The wounds were fatal. Marvin Gaye collapsed to the floor inside the house where he had once tried so desperately to escape the fear of his childhood. He died that afternoon at the age of 44, only one day before his 45th birthday. The news spread across the music world with shocking speed. Radio stations interrupted programming. Musicians and fans struggled to understand how one of the most influential voices in soul music could die in such a tragic and personal conflict. In the years that followed, Marvin Gaye's music continued to grow in influence. Albums like What's Going On, Let's Get It On, and Sexual Healing became permanent parts of the history of rhythm and blues. His voice, gentle, vulnerable, and deeply emotional, inspired generations of singers who came after him. But his story carried something heavier than musical success. Behind the millions of records and the legendary songs was a life shaped by emotional wounds that fame could never erase. Marvin Gaye had written music about love, healing, and the human need for compassion. Yet the deepest conflict in his life had always remained inside the family he came from. Even decades later, his voice still fills radios, documentaries, and concert halls around the world. But every time those songs play, the same haunting truth quietly follows them. The man who gave the world some of its most beautiful music never fully escaped the pain that began in his own home. How could someone whose voice brought comfort to millions still be trapped by a past he could never truly leave behind? In the years after Marvin Gaye's death, the world slowly began to understand the full weight of his story. At first, the headlines focused on the shocking detail: a legendary singer killed by his own father. But as time passed, the conversation shifted. People began looking deeper into the life behind the tragedy. Marvin Gaye was not only a Motown star or a successful recording artist. He was a musician who transformed soul music into something more personal and reflective. Albums like What's Going On proved that popular music could speak about war, social pain, and human vulnerability without losing its emotional power. His voice carried a softness that allowed listeners to feel the sadness and hope inside the same song. Yet the contradictions in his life never disappeared. The same sensitivity that made his music so powerful also made him emotionally fragile. The childhood fear that followed him into adulthood shaped the way he saw the world, the way he trusted people, and the way he responded to conflict. Fame gave him a platform, but it could not repair the wounds that formed long before the spotlight found him. Today, Marvin Gaye is remembered as one of the greatest voices in the history of soul music. His songs continue to influence artists decades after they were recorded. But his story also leaves behind a quieter question that lingers beneath the music. If the boy who grew up in that house in Washington had found peace earlier in his life, would the man the world later called Marvin Gaye have reached a different ending?